content. The last time we were together before the exam, we were talking about the early 19th century. We were talking about Romanticism. Okay, we are now, again, since Neoclassicism, since the sort of mid-18th century, we've been in the so-called modern era. It's not a very good name, but we don't have anything better. And I talked about the fact that this is an era in which we see a series of isms, rather than these sort of prolonged period styles like the Baroque, the Renaissance. We have a series of isms that are sort of movements and counter-movements that succeed one another relatively quickly. And also unique about them is they don't have really clear sort of geographic or chronological borders. So, to some extent, they overlap with one another. And that is not what we've seen previously. So remember all those things that are kind of are part of the context of this sort of modern era, or this modern period. So we were talking about Romanticism, and Romanticism, I remember saying, was a counter-movement to the Neoclassical, right, to Neoclassicism, and the Romantics criticized the Neoclassicists, and they criticized the Neoclassicists as being escapist, right, escaping into the ancient past, not addressing the issues of the day. And so we talked about Romantics as sort of representing some of the first current events, in quotes, not really current events, but sort of recent history events, right? But what's interesting is that this next group, which are called the realists, so we're going to be talking about realism today, this next group criticized the Romantics for being escapist. So the way that the Romantics criticized the Neoclassicists for being escapist, escaping into sort of the art of the ancient past, right, neglecting the issues of the day. The realists are going to level the same criticism at the Romantics, but they're going to say that their emphasis on emotion is escapist, right? Because emphasis on emotion, right, creates pathos in the viewer. And therefore, it undermines sort of faithful representation, objective representation of the facts of the day. So the realists are going to set out to paint the reality of daily life. That's what they're about. They want to paint the realities of daily life. No pathos, no emotion. They want to paint those realities objectively, almost journalistically, reportorially, sort of clinically, right? Present the facts, but not take sides with those, not have an opinion on those facts, just like a journalist, just like a reporter. The idea of, again, presenting the facts and letting the viewer decide. So I want you to think about that. And it's no accident we're talking about realism, with a capital R, and it's no accident that the backdrop for this period is still industrialization. I want you to think about a couple of things. So we talked about industrialization as being the backdrop for the entire 19th century, but really it's not until now we are in 1850. So realism, right, if you remember Romanticism, I gave you 1800 to 1850, right, with the sort of peak of Romanticism being in the 1830s. Realism now can be thought of as being sort of 1850, well, realism is going to be 1850 to 1860. Then we're going to have something called naturalism, which is closely related, which is 1860 to 1870. And then we're going to have something called impressionism, which is 1870 to roughly 1880. So now you can see that these isms, right, these movements and counter-movements are actually succeeding one another very quickly. We're not talking about 50-year period, we're talking about 10-year period, a decade or more. And again, this is all, remember, no chronological, no geographic border, so this is all sort of fluid. But basically, we can sort of talk about, realism being the decade of the 1850s, naturalism 1860s, impressionism 1870s, and so forth. Now, all of these things are actually under the sort of heading realism. They're all different branches of the sort of category realism. And we will talk about that, sort of what I want to focus on today. I don't know how much into impressionism we'll get, but they're all sort of under the heading of realism. They're sort of different branches or different sort of varieties of realism. And I want you to think about all of this against the backdrop of industrialization, right? Because again, we talked about industrialization being the context for the entire 19th century, but really, we're talking about a revved up industrialization. Starting in the 1830s, we see the invention of steam technology. So steam ship, steam train, which revolutionizes transportation. We see the invention, for our purposes, of the photograph. 1839 is the daguerreotype, which is the predecessor of the contemporary photograph. We see lots of things happening in the 1830s, right, in particular. And so right about 1850, all of those technologies are coming to a peak, right? They're beginning to be widely disseminated. So we see the daguerreotype in 1839. It's not really widely disseminated until the 1850s, even 1860s, even a little bit later, right? So we're really seeing in this moment all those technologies becoming more widely disseminated, becoming more widely available. So we're talking about a really amped up industrialization. Whereas industrialization didn't really have an impact on the Romantics, it's absolutely going to have an impact on this generation, okay? And we'll talk about that. We are talking about a period of very quick modernization of urban city centers in Europe. Industrialization begins in Britain and spreads relatively quickly to France, right, on the continent. So England and France are the two most industrialized nations in this period. And we're going to talk about what happens to Paris in this period. Paris as a city, completely sort of modernized, urbanized, becoming a sort of a modern urban environment in this period. And that's really important as an impact on artists, right? Seeing the city, and we'll talk about what it means to go from a city of sort of meandering medieval streets that used to be cow paths, right? And sort of dilapidated buildings in crowded neighborhoods, right? All-inclusive neighborhoods where everybody sort of lived together, worked together, went to school together, shopped together, to the modern urban environment, which is one of districts. If you think about any modern society or any modern city you go to, right? Think about New York. You have specific residential districts, right, for specific classes. You have specific shopping districts. You can go to the garment district. You can go to the tech district. You can go to, et cetera. You know, you've got, I don't know what, the meatpacking district. So all these things. And that's really what happens to Paris in this period. It transforms, and we'll talk specifically about it because it has a huge impact on the generation, on Manet and the Impressionists. Paris goes from, again, sort of a medieval city, if you will, sort of medieval roots with medieval origins, based on these self-contained neighborhoods, right, that really residents never particularly left, to a modern urban environment in which, right, you lived in one place, now you went to work in a different district, you went to school in a different district, you did your shopping in a different district. So what it means is that people are traveling across wide swaths of the city on a daily basis and coming into contact with other classes of people, right, that they normally wouldn't rub shoulders with. And this is a huge piece of the modern urban environment, and we're going to talk about it because it just originates here. And what happens is, all of a sudden, when you're rubbing shoulders with people from different classes, and you don't have the tools to communicate with those different classes, because you've never come in contact with them before, results in something, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself, but it results in something called alienation. And we'll touch back on this when we get to naturalism. I've got to do this first. But alienation is actually theorized by a German social scientist named Georg Simmel. And what he says is that this phenomenon of the modern urban environment that results in, this is what he says, close physical proximity, but great psychological distance. Meaning, again, different classes are coming into close physical contact now in ways that they didn't before. On mass transit, right? In shops, even in the workplace, okay? But they don't have the tools, the means to communicate across classes, and that results in great psychological distance. So there is this feeling of alienation that the first generation of people living in a modern urban environment experience. You gotta think about what it would be like to live in a modern city for the first time. Sort of be the first generation to live in so-called quote-unquote modern urban environment. Very different than sort of self-sufficient neighborhoods, right, that have a much safer feeling. I think of alienation as being the idea of sort of never feeling more alone than when you're in a crowd, right? This idea of being physically proximate with lots of people, but not knowing any of them is kind of a strange feeling, right? It's a sort of strange concept of, feeling really alone in a crowd of people. And that's exactly, what this sort of philosophy, this theory is. And we're going to actually see that in painting of this period. We're going to see the face of alienation. We're going to see artists are grappling with this feeling, and so therefore they're going to try to paint it, right? To try to represent in painting. A couple other things. So industrialization, all of this sort of urbanization, modernization of city centers, we're going to talk about. On the other hand, we have journalism, an explosion of journalism. And the reason for that is, remember, during the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, 1815 to 1830, remember, one of the reasons we see the revolution of 1830 is because Charles X reinstated censorship, press censorship, right? And that was widely unpopular in France, right? In part, the reason that the French people overthrew him in 1830. We end up in 1830 with a constitutional monarchy, which is not much better. So in 1848, and this is actually, here we are at 1850, we're going to see a painting. We're going to start with this painting, which is 1848, 1849. In 1848, there is another revolution in France. Okay? This is the third revolution the French have had in an attempt to install that sort of elusive republic, right, the French have been longing for. So in 1848, there's yet another revolution that overthrows the constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe, and we get what's called the Second Republic, from 1848 only to 1852. So again, it's short-lived, right? And here, let me just put a little bit of this on the board. Because this is all I'm giving you, every time I start a new chapter or a new period style, I want to try to give you as much context as possible. So in 1848, we have a revolution, right, that overthrows the constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe and establishes a republic. It's called the Second Republic. And then interestingly, in 1848, a guy by the name of Louis Napoleon, bless you, comes along, or is on the scene in France. He is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, and Louis Napoleon is very interested in politics. So in the aftermath of the French Revolution of 1848, he does something very strange, which is he declares himself president of the Republic, which you don't do in a republic. But somehow, miraculously, that's later borne out by elections. So he declares himself president and then manages, right, to get that borne out by election. He manages to get himself elected after he declares himself president, right? Really, again, because of lack of another alternative, right? And because things are going so well for him, so he becomes the president of the Second Republic. And because things went so well when he declared himself president of France, he decides in 1851 to declare himself emperor of France. And there, lo and behold, from 1852, and this is the period we're covering today, almost exactly, to 1870, he is emperor of France. And this is what's called the period of the Second Empire. Right? The first empire being that of his uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon I. This is Napoleon III. Okay? So that's sort of the rest of the French history lesson that you need. French history in this period is incredibly convoluted, as you can see, right? Revolution after revolution after revolution, trying to establish a republic. The republic keeps being ill-fated and something else takes its place. This is the period where Paris becomes modernized. In large part because Louis Napoleon hires an engineer to modernize the city. He specifically sets out to modernize the city, and there are reasons for that. One of the things is that he wants to, two things, if you think about it. Remember Liberty Leading the People, that painting of the Revolution of 1830, with Lady Liberty climbing up over a barricade, right? So all of these revolutions, the French Revolution of 1879, the Revolution of 1830, the Revolution of 1848, all were successful because of those medieval streets, those meandering medieval streets. And the people could relatively easily stop the flow of troops into specific areas by creating barricades across those streets. So we have this phenomenon of the barricade. It's sort of a people's, it's a weapon, but it's sort of a people's weapon, right? Because of the way the city was established, based on these medieval sort of these cow paths that became these meandering streets, it was relatively easy to blockade, to create barricades, and to block the movement of troops. Which is why these three revolutions had been successful. Louis Napoleon understands that, right? And so he decides that he wants to get rid of those meandering medieval streets, straighten and broaden the streets, creating broad boulevards that are no longer possible to close off with barricades, and that make for an easy flow of troop movements, right, for ease of troop movement. So he is modernizing this city. He's creating one of the first sort of truly modern urban environments, but in large part he's doing it for military reasons. In large part, he's doing it in order to make sure that there isn't another revolution that can overthrow him. Okay? So, it sounds like a really sort of philanthropic plan, but in essence, it's not. He hires an engineer named Osman, and we'll come back to all this, but I'll give you all the context at once. An engineer by the name of Eugene Osman to modernize the city. And he tells him exactly what he's looking for. He's looking for broad, straight streets, right? He's looking for, again, no more sort of isolated neighborhoods. So all of these neighborhoods in the city center are leveled to make way for these sort of broad tree-lined streets. And he's looking for, what else? Districts. So this idea of districting. If anybody has been to France, you know that Paris has 20 districts called arrondissements. So those districts came into place under Osman, right? So it's 20 areas. And this whole process is called the Osmanization of Paris. And this is really the backdrop for Manet and the Impressionists. They are painting, right, during this period of Osmanization of Paris. And with any modernization, there are winners and there are losers. And this is very much a part of the art of this period, right? Because we're going to see, right, there are those who do the work, who do the labor, to broaden and strengthen those boulevards, and there are those who enjoy, right, the fruits of their labor. And they're often not the same people. So there are winners and losers. There are those whose neighborhoods are leveled, people who have to be relocated to the outskirts of the city, right, when they used to live in the city center, to the sort of 19th century equivalent of sort of urban housing, right? So there are definitely whole swaths of the population that are big-time losers in this, right? The flip side is there are a lot of people, right, who are winners. The Paris that we see today, the look of Paris that we see today, that is, for all intents and purposes, incredibly stunningly beautiful, with these broad boulevards, the Champs-Élysées, et cetera, tree-lined boulevards, cafe-lined boulevards, right? And these beautiful 6-story buildings. Osman also put into place a zoning law that said you couldn't have a building over 6 stories, which is why there's no skyscrapers in Paris today. So lots of things that Osman did. He created the look of the city today. He created an incredibly beautiful city, but again, at the expense of a lot of people. So this is sort of the aftermath, the backdrop of all of this, and we'll talk more specifically about what that looks like. But Manet and the Impressionists are growing up seeing their city, large parts of their city, in rubble, because to get to those broad tree-lined boulevards, you have to destroy whole neighborhoods. You have to reduce them to rubble. So, we were talking about this generation being really displaced, feeling really displaced, and sort of seeing the city in rubble. And Osman, for that reason, is nicknamed the Destroyer. Right? So here he is, this engineer. He's also a baron. He's an aristocrat. Right? He's an engineer, beloved by Napoleon III, and he's nicknamed by the people of Paris the Destroyer. Okay, so you can sort of get a sense for his popularity during this process. Industrialization, okay, journalism, and again, when Louis Philippe, who was the constitutional monarch, is ousted after the Revolution of 1848, we see new freedoms of the press, right? We see sort of new freedoms of the press come in with the Second Republic. And so we have an explosion of journalism in this period. It's really important because the artists are taking their cues from that sort of journalistic approach to things that is objective. Remember, journalists have to be objective at all costs. It is sort of reportorial, clinical, right? Presentation of the facts, right? Without responding to those facts, okay? Presentation of the issues without sort of taking sides in those issues. So we're going to see this explosion of journalism. We're also going to see an explosion of pictorial style called realism that does just that. It has this sort of reportorial outlook, and we're going to look at that in just a moment. Yeah, Ian.
In the Second Empire, journalism completely used.
So Louis Napoleon is pretty good. Yeah, he doesn't really reinstate censorship. Okay. So after the kings, we had Charles X, who was the worst. He was the restored Bourbon monarch. Then we had the constitutional monarch, Louis Philippe, who was a lot better. But in the aftermath of this revolution, things get a lot better, right? Louis Napoleon, sorry, part, he's an emperor, he actually is relatively tolerant as a person. And he doesn't, I'm not saying, that he had his reasons for modernizing the city, for example. But he's relatively tolerant in the sense of, again, he doesn't reinstate press censorship, right? He doesn't, again, sort of curtail voting rights. He sort of strip people of their voting rights. He allows for the continued separation of church and state. Remember, Charles X put education back in the hands of the church and so forth. So Louis Napoleon is relatively sort of tolerant on these issues. And yeah, we have an explosion of journalism in this period, okay? Okay, so we're gonna start, having said all that, oh, no, there's one more thing, sorry. Philosophically, so we've got industrialization, rampant industrialization. We've got rampant journalism, uncensored. And in terms of philosophy, we have a philosophy called positivism. We have a philosophy called positivism. That is a philosophy that is promulgated by a Frenchman named Gustave Comte. Beginning in the 1830s, but again, really taking hold now. And positivism, in a lot of ways, can be seen as sort of the final stage in the development of philosophical thought, okay? And positivism says that ultimately, all knowledge is derived from objective scientific methods, period. And so again, that kind of philosophy goes hand in hand with objective journalism, if you think about it, right? This idea of all things coming from sort of objective, sort of scientific methods, okay? So all of these things together give rise to a very specific style of painting that's called realism. And there really is only one practitioner of realism in France at the time. And his name is Gustave Courbet. So we're going to start today talking about Courbet, and then we will get to Manet. So Gustave Courbet, C-O-U-R-B-E-T, is the important realist in mid-19th century France. And we're going to start by looking at a painting of his called The Stonebreakers. The Stonebreakers, 1849, right? So look at that date. It's 1 year, right, after the Third French Revolution, or Revolution of 1848, okay? Courbet, again, is an artist who feels like the romantic emphasis on emotion was escaped, okay? So he set out to paint the realities of everyday life. And he set out to paint them with no pathos, no emotion, right? Matter-of-factly, naturalistically. Sort of, again, really sort of clinically, sort of reportorially. He wanted to make people aware of what was going on, right, in this so-called period of Osmanization, of what was going on in this so-called period of modernization, urbanization. He wanted to make people aware of the losers, right, in these scenarios. Just aware of their presence, of their existence, okay? Not taking sides, not, again, trying to use emotion to beget emotion. He didn't want an emotional view of it, right? He just wanted to present the objective facts, the same way that a journalist wants to present the objective facts. So Courbet actually grew up, he was provincial, he was not from Paris. He grew up in a town called Ornans, which is in a region of France called the Franche-Comté. But again, the idea is that he was provincial. He was not a Parisian. He was a little rough around the edges. He was self-taught as a painter completely. And a lot of his paintings represent provincial subjects. again, represent what he saw on a daily basis. He set out, remember, to paint the realities of everyday life. So he's going to paint what he sees in his native Ornol, okay? So these are not Parisian scenes, right? These are provincial scenes. And that in part is going to get him into trouble, and we'll talk about that. But, so here we have the Stonebreakers. And this is, so the story goes, literally a scene that he saw driving home in his carriage one day. He passed two men breaking stone by the side of the road. And he was immediately moved by the scene. So the story goes that he pulled his carriage over, and he asked the two men to come to his studio to have their portraits painted the next day. And he is reported to have said, quote, the one will look just like the one will end up looking just like the other. What did he mean by that? And so, again, these two men did come to the studio, and this is the resulting painting. But Courbet's quote is, the one will end up looking just like the other. What did he mean by that? Nehemiah?
That there's not going to be any difference between them, like there's no expression from their faces, and the faces are very similar as well.
Okay, so, yeah, that's a different take on it than where I was going with it, but yeah, I mean, I think that, you mean, were we to see their faces, their expressions, that there wouldn't be any sort of significant difference, because they're both in this sort of line of work together, and they're both having the same experiences, is that what you're saying? Okay, any other takes on it? Abby?
That the painting that he did of them in his studio was exactly like the scene that he saw on the side of the road.
Okay, these are interesting takes, so okay, I like that too. Anything else? What do you notice about these two men that strikes you as being different? How are they different? Lexi.
One looks like younger than the other.
Yeah, age, right? One is vastly young. One it looks like quite a boy, really, and one looks like an old man. Okay. Having said that, what do you think he means? The one will end up just like the other. Ian.
That, like a personal identity is just attributed to what, like, an occupation is. So, like, if they're stonebreakers, they're stonebreakers.
Okay.
More than that.
Yeah. Erica?
Is it kind of similar to like Memento Mori, like they're both just gonna die in the end anyways?
Yeah. So I think Trinity, do you want to add something?
Yeah.
So the idea is that once you are in sort of what Ian said, once you are in this line of work, the one will end up just like the other. The young man will end up an old man bent and broken by the side of the road. When you are in this line of work, when you are a laborer, there is no escaping this line of work. There's no upward mobility, right? When you're a laborer for life, right? Is essentially what he meant. The one will end up just like, and I think when I said will end up looking just like the other, it was misleading. The one will end up just like the other, meaning the young boy will end up just like the old man, bent and broken by the side of the road. 50 years from now, he's still going to be doing this thankless task. Okay? Why do you think Courbet averted their faces? Why do you think he hasn't given us their faces? India.
Because, I guess part of the whole point of what you were saying, the one will end up just like the other, is that they don't really have a personal identity when it comes to that and their place in their lives. It's not affected by who they are as a person. It's just you're another cog in the machine.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I like that. You were just another cog in this machine, right? Exactly. All laborers are the same. They're all going to end up bent and broken by the side of the road. These laborers, these two stonebreakers, are the losers in this scenario. I mean, they're the losers in modernization, in urbanization, in Osmanization. These two guys they're breaking stone to clear a road that will end up being paved, not contemporary paved, but will end up being paved. And that's the road that connects Ornol to Paris. Okay? So this is part of urbanization, right? This is part of the modernization of the country of France, laying roads that will connect, right, the provinces to the cities. So these guys are building the road that will connect Ornol to Paris, but they'll probably never travel it. That's the idea, right? They are the losers in this scenario. They're not going to really sort of reap the rewards, the benefits of their own labors. And why else does he not show their faces? What happens immediately? What did Courbet want to avoid at all costs? What happens immediately when he shows these guys' faces? Erica? You cannot help. There's going to be some kind of expression of emotion. They're going to look fatigued, right? Even wizened. You can even see, just with the profile, you really get a sense, and sort of the back of the older man's hand, of sort of how sun how sort of dry and desiccated his skin is as a result of consistent exposure to the elements, right? And Courbet, as soon as he turns their faces to us, right, they may express some emotion, but even if their emotion is restrained, we will experience emotion as viewers, right? And remember, Courbet does not want to do that. This is not about creating creating pathos, right? Pity, right? In the viewer. This is about reporting the facts of what he saw driving home one day. Okay? Again, just like it's almost like an illustration accompanying a newspaper article, right? And in fact, we're going to start to see that very thing. Because remember, this is now 1849. 10 years previously, we had the daguerreotype, the prototype of photography. Very quickly here, we're going to see all of the, I said an explosion of journalism, we're going to see those journals, those newspapers, accompanied by actual photographs, not just by sketches. Originally, journals and newspapers were accompanied by sketches, artist sketches of what was going on. But we're going to actually see photographs, the first photographs published, the first photographic evidence of news accounts, right? And this is kind of that same idea, right? Courbet, again, he wants to avoid pathos, he wants to avoid emotion. So I want to talk to you just briefly about it in terms of style. We've talked a lot about subject, right? We understand that these guys are the laborers, they're the losers in sort of modernization. And that Courbet, again, he set out to paint the realities of daily life. He saw this scene, and so he decided he wanted to paint it, right? To expose their plight, but really, again, not just to expose their presence, right? To expose the facts of their existence, right? To people Parisians who just as soon forget about their existence. They want to travel that road guilt-free. They don't really want to be reminded of the fact that that road that they're traveling that's so smooth now, right, to Paris, was built on the backs of laborers. So Courbet just wants to literally sort of record their presence, okay? Tell me a little bit about style, though, and what do you notice about style here? In terms of composition first I want to talk about. Brush work, color, right? What do you notice? Because Courbet is actually doing something very, very conscious here. I want to talk about composition for a second, because it's really interesting, right? First of all, where's the focal point? There are two figures here. Who's the focal point? Ian.
I think the older man.
Do you? Okay. Anybody else? Focal point generally what? When we're drawn to a focal point, we're drawn to it, right, because of either perspective, because of placement, the figure is centered, top, bottom, right, left, because of scale, the figure is larger, because of color, the figure is brighter. Is that true of either of these figures? No. Nehemiah.
I feel like it's more the road.
Okay. Trinity.
Personally, I'm kind of more drawn into the axe in the center
Okay.
of it.
Okay. Did anybody else want to weigh in? I mean, India.
I don't know. I mean, like, it's sort of hard to sort of
It is,
try
and that's the point.
figure out.
It is, right? Because the point is there's no focal point, right? Courbet does not want, he is going to avoid all of those rules of composition that we've been talking about since day one in this class. He's going to avoid, right, conventions of composition. He's going to avoid triangular and pyramidal, right, groupings of figures. Because why? Because those create hierarchies. Whoever's at the top of the triangular pyramid, we've seen that over and over again. We saw it with the Raft and the Medusa. We saw it with Liberty Leading the People. We saw it with early Renaissance pieces, right? That put, again, all of the biblical figures in a triangle with God the Father at the apex of the triangle. There are lots of Virgin and Child, again, same thing, Virgin and Child at the apex of the triangle. He wants to avoid that. This is what, and we're going to see it again. Courbet, again, is absolutely avoiding using compositional groupings, figure groupings to create hierarchy, because neither of these figures is more important than the other, right? There is no focal point. It's the whole scene that he wants us to focus on.
And also the whole idea of creating a composition will kind of go against what he's
Good
doing
for you.
because
Yes.
this is a real
Yes.
scene.
Yes, exactly
So
right.
he's not
right?
trying to make
He's setting
anything
out to
up.
paint what he saw, right? And they weren't sort of, in this neat triangle when he saw them by the side of the road. So he's painting what he saw. So there is no focal point. Now he's going to be criticized for that because the Academy, right? Our critics expect to see that kind of conscious composition. They want a hierarchy. They want to be told who the most important figures are, right? What's the relationship between them? So this is all really new and different. So he is criticized for lack of conscious composition. He's criticized also, tell me about, I want to keep on, you've got to remind me, this is my 19th century stuff, so this is where I'm going to start to slow down again, so keep going. I want to talk about composition, though, a little bit more quickly. So no focal point, right? What about space? Remember, in Renaissance art, we talked about a specific focal point, usually centered in the composition, at sort of the vanishing point of a perspectival system. We talked about deeply receding space. All those things are absent here. We don't have deeply receding space. Instead, we have one of these hills that comes right down to the edge of the road, behind the figures. What does that do to the space that the figures inhabit? Think about that. So again, why this hill, this sort of shadowy hill that comes down right to the edge of the road? What does it do in terms of the position of the figures? They become what? Also, think about, if this guy were to stand up, what would happen to him? Where would his head be? Jay?
Off the picture.
Yeah, outside the framing edge, right? If our boy were to sort of really stand straight, he might too, again, sort of be outside of the framing edge of the picture. What does that do? Why this horizontal orientation of the picture plane? First of all, it helps with this sort of more democratic organization of figures, right? Spread out across the picture plane, evenly presented and weighted. But what else is happening with composition in terms of front to back and top to bottom space? What do you feel? Why does Courbet crop the picture plane so close to these figures? Yeah.
Because then it feels like the scene exactly that as he saw, like you're in your carriage on their own, you looked out the window and saw these two.
Yep. And the fact that that space, right, is so tightly cropped around those figures creates what kind of a sense, right? This guy, he can't really straighten up because he'll be outside of the picture plane, right? So it's creating what kind of a sense of space?
Like claustrophobic?
Yes. It creates a sense of compression. The space is closing in on them, top to bottom, right? It's forcing, almost as if the space itself is forcing the figure to be bent, right? And Courbet wants us to feel that feeling of being bent over by the side of the road, with that picture plane kind of closing in on us. And then front to back too. These figures are squeezed between a hill and a road. They're squeezed into what I like to call the breakdown lane. They exist in that breakdown lane. They exist in that narrow space by the side of the road all day, day in and day out. They can't move into deep space because there's a hill there, and they can't move into the road because their carriage is there. You can even see the remnants of their lunch here, right? Beside the road. You get very much this sense that they stay in that breakdown lane. They're squeezed front to back, and they're squeezed top to bottom. So the composition is very compressing. It creates a sense of claustrophobia, of compression, right? Of weight. And look at the weight of the basket of stones. Can you imagine how heavy that basket of crushed stone would be? And this little boy is trying to manage it, right? Trying to sort of balance it, right, on his raised knee. They've got to break the stone and they've got to remove it from the roadbed. So Courbet is trying to also create this sense of weight, sort of just crushing weight, the weight of the stone, the weight of the heat of the sun, the weight of this job, right? That is inescapable. The one will end up just like the other. There really is no out here. If you begin your life as a laborer, you end your life bent and broken as a laborer. Okay? It's this idea of inescapability, that these guys are trapped in this breakdown lane, that Courbet wants to get across. And amazingly, he does it all without ever showing their faces, right? He purports to be objective, but he is in fact making us feel a lot more than he would admit, right? Even without showing their faces, we end up sort of feeling quite a bit. Tell me quickly about brushwork and color. What do you notice?
The immediate thing I noticed about color is that it's all muted colors.
Absolutely. Why? Color has a really important effect, right, on emotions. Remember, Courbet, again, reputedly not trying to sort of, create an emotional viewer, but his color choice is going to have an impact, right? Why? Why is it all muted?
I have two guesses.
Yeah.
One is, like, the more objective, like it's the sun bleach.
Yep, yep,
The way things look in that blinding summer light.
yep,
And also maybe just to kind of show the absolute dull monotony
Yep.
of being.
both of those are absolutely spot on. I mean, that was really great. Yeah, I mean, the idea is, this is probably the way it looked. You don't wear sort of bright red clothes, to break stone by the side or whatever, but, this is exactly as Abby said. This is a dusty breakdown lane, right? The stone is being smashed to rubble. There's all sorts of dust. There's heat, right? Heat of the day. This is southern France. So all of those things, it's sort of, you can tell that all of the foliage has been sort of bleached, as Abby said, sort of, sun bleached, desiccated, right? This is that, and that's in part because this is what that area of the country looks like, in the summer in southern France. But also, there is symbolic content here, or symbolic import of the color, right? This idea of sort of being the muted colors, right, suggest, again, sort of the dull monotony, exactly as Abby said, of this kind of work, right? It would be incredibly off-putting if we saw bright jewel tones in this picture, right? It wouldn't make any sense. What about brushwork? Does anybody notice, is this that sort of licked surface, that polished academic surface? Lexi's saying no. Nehemiah?
It's somewhere in between, because it's not like the fine brushwork of like classicism, or I might be confusing the isms, but
No, you're right.
yeah, it's not the fine hard strokes of it, but it's still like each figure does have their own borders.
Okay.
And everything is separated, but it's not as hard.
Okay.
It's still.
Okay, I would agree with that. What about all of the sort of brushwork here that sort of represents the stone? Trinity?
I was gonna say that like the people more relate to like the neoclassical style, while I feel like the environment that they're
Okay.
around is like more of the romanticism.
Okay.
It seems more of like a rough
Okay,
outline of like
I would
the
buy that.
stones and the wheat in the background.
Yeah.
More impressionistic.
okay, I would buy that. The critics of this painting, they criticized it for lacking conscious composition. They also criticized it for lacking academic finish, right? Two things they came to expect that this did not have. But what Courbet is doing with this lack of academic finish, and Trinity used the word rough, which I think is particularly appropriate, this rough brushwork is again supposed to represent this rough work that they're doing, this rough labor that they're doing. I lectured for a while, so it's going to be hard on my voice. So the criticisms, again, that were leveled against him by the Academy and by the critics, in fact, in some ways were spot on, right? But Courbet wasn't trying, he wasn't going for composition, academic composition, and he wasn't going for academic finish either, right? Okay, I'm gonna force myself to move on. Does anybody have any questions? So that's basically, this is sort of a painting, about the brutality of modern life. Again, about those losers in the context of modernization, right? The rough paint, right? The dull colors, the awkward poses, all tie into that, right? All sort of speak to that brutality of modern life that Courbet is trying to expose like a reporter. Trinity.
The objects, I've noticed, like, there's a lot of them, like, kind of reminding me of, like, the not Broco, what period?
You're
Where
just,
they, like, have a hypertension, like, just how the basket is created, like, seems like he paid, like, hyper detail to that.
yeah.
Pot in the background, which isn't necessary, so is that, like, an element?
Yeah, so I mean, all of these, these are all their tools, right? I mean, so you don't do labor, you don't do sort of physical work without tools, right? So I think it was really important that for Courbet to represent their pickaxes, right? These are the instruments, right, that they're gonna use to break that stone. And the baskets that they're gonna use to remove that stone from the roadway. Those are their two jobs, break stone and remove it from the roadbed, right? So we need to see the tools of their trade. It makes their work that much more palpable still. Courbet wants to make their existence inescapably real, inescapably present, right? And I think this is a really nice touch because while it's not necessary, this is their lunch, as I said, right? That's their lunch. I mean, the idea that they don't even get to escape for lunch. They're sitting in this dust under the baking sun for lunch as well, You know, the best they get is, you know, a pot of soup that, you know, their wife or mother gave them in the morning, you know, sitting on, you know, a sheet by the side of the road in the blazing sun. You know, there's really no respite even, you know, to eat or drink. So I think that all of the presence of these objects, and you're right, they're very visible. They're, you know, the presence of these objects is really part of the story, right? It's part of the story that Courbet is trying to tell. We didn't even talk about their sort of tattered clothing, right? Very clear that Courbet is trying to make a lot of the fact, you know, this guy's breeches have been patched, you know, a million times, right? This guy's pants, you know, have sort of torn hem. He's got a big hole in the back of his shirt. He's got a big hole in his vest. You know, these guys are literally sort of, you know, reduced to you know, they're wearing sort of this, you know, this tattered clothing. You know, that again is part of the sort of, you know, the back-breaking work that they're doing. Is represented in those torn, the same way that this work is, you know, sort of is destroying their bodies, it's also destroying their clothing. Okay, so all these things, again, these choices are conscious, despite the fact that Courbet is you know, sort of purporting objectivity. His choices are very conscious. So I want to sort of make that point clear. Sadly for us, this painting doesn't exist anymore. It only exists in photographic record, because it was destroyed by bombs during the Second World War. So you will not ever, sadly, be able to see, nor will I, that painting in person. So Courbet's next major breakthrough work is this one. And this is called A Burial at Home. And it is the following year, 1849, 1850. Okay, and I do want to read you a Courbet quote. Courbet is famous for a number of quotes. One of his most famous quotes is, "Show me an angel, and I'll paint you an angel." Right? What does he mean by that? Sophia.
He's like kind of indicating that like angels don't exist, and he's only going to paint what's real.
He's only going to paint what he sees, right? Since we can't see angels, he's not going to paint them, right? Again, remember, setting out to paint, to record the realities of daily life. And specifically, that which he has seen and experienced, right? So he would not have, would he have painted the raft of Medusa?
No.
No. Even though that was an actual event, right? News of it reached France, okay? He had not experienced it, he had not witnessed it, so he would not paint it. Same way he wouldn't paint an angel. He will never paint a religious work with biblical figures because he hasn't seen those figures, plain and simple. He also, this is a longer quote, but he also says, painting is essentially a concrete art and can only consist of the representation of real and existing things. Think about how many things, think about how many subjects that eliminates from the artist's repertoire. Almost all the subjects that we've been looking at so far, right? It is a completely physical language, the words of which consist of all visible objects. An object which is abstract, not physical, non-existent, is not within the realm of painting. So again, show me an angel and I'll paint you an angel. Okay, so that's the kind of perspective that Courbet is coming from. Okay, let's look at this painting. So this is called A Burial at Arnold. And again, it is a scene that he actually witnessed firsthand. He was present at this burial because this is the burial of his great uncle, okay? His maternal grandfather's brother. Burial that actually took place in 1849 in Arnold. Okay? And he again is setting out to paint it just as he experienced it, right? Sort of objectively, reportorially. Okay? And once again, this painting was criticized. It was actually heaped with criticism when it was exhibited in Paris. The Parisian critics hated it. And there are psychological reasons that they hated it that we can talk about. But they claimed to hate it for its style. They claimed to hate it, again, for lack of conscious composition. They claimed to hate it for lack of academic finish. And they claimed to hate it because Courbet here, now I want you to think about this. This painting, I'm just going to take you for, that's okay, it's important. This painting is over 10 feet tall by over 21 feet wide. This is a massive painting. It contains 50 some odd figures, all of which are life-size. So this is a massive, massive painting. Paintings of this scale were reserved for what subjects traditionally by the Academy? Do you think, Ian? Religious, or what's the other term? Yeah, Jay.
Royal?
So royal painting is not a genre. So for a royal patron, perhaps, but in terms of category of subject, religious painting, so biblical painting, or what else?
Historical.
History. Exactly. Right. So Courbet submits this painting, right, to the Academy as a history painting. Right? He submits it to the Salon, which is the exhibition arm of the Academy, as a history painting. Okay? And the academicians are scratching their heads saying, this isn't history painting. This is, what do we call a scene from daily life? It has a traditional, there is a traditional category for a scene from daily life. Do you remember? Yeah? Genre. And it's 2 levels down from history painting in terms of importance. Remember that hierarchy? The Academy loved their hierarchies. 2 levels down from history. History, portraiture, genre painting. This is genre painting, a scene from daily life. Not only that, it's a provincial genre painting. It's not even an upper middle class genre painting. When we were in the Dutch Baroque, we saw sort of genre paintings that became quite popular because they were daily life scenes of the upper middle classes. That was acceptable to some extent. Collectors kind of like that. But who wants to see, right, the provincial bourgeoisie on this massive scale previously reserved for history painting? So Courbet was criticized too for treating a genre painting, a provincial burial, on a heroic scale, on a scale previously reserved for history painting. And that was thought of as being akin to sacrilege by the Academy. It loves its rules, it loves its hierarchy of genres, it loves its accepted standards of composition, it loves its accepted standards of finish, etc. Right? So again, the figures here, instead of being arranged in some kind of hierarchy, are spread out across the picture plane horizontally, like before, almost frieze-like. A prominent scholar has called this democracy in painting. And I like that phrase. The idea being that no one of these figures is really more important than any other. There is no hierarchy. This is simply a group of villagers, the friends and family of the deceased, who come together collectively in unity to mourn. Right? And Courbet consciously treats this burial horizontally rather than vertically, because in all other scenes of death, think Renaissance scenes of death and the immediate aftermath of death. What do you see? If he had treated it vertically, right, and let's say the deceased was down, right, at the base, right, what does that sort of vertical orientation of the picture plane leave room for? What's supposed to happen to the dead after death?
And they rise to heaven and the afterlife.
Absolutely, right? They rise up into the heavens. There is always a suggestion, right, of the heavens or of redemption in any other burial pictures that we've seen. And they're almost always treated, think Assumption of the Virgin scenes over and over again, the Renaissance, vertically, always. Because what we're looking at, right, the focal point, is her rising into the heavens at the top of the hierarchy. Courbet is avoiding that by choosing a horizontal format, which is really, really interesting. Okay? So I want to sort of just quickly look at this. A lot of the same things go here, we've said before. So criticized for avoiding conscious composition. I'm actually going to argue that the composition is extremely conscious, and I'm going to sort of talk to you a little bit more about how Courbet has actually organized his mourners here. It looks like just sort of a haphazard sea, right, of figures. But actually, if we look really carefully, if we do sort of the careful looking that this painting requires, we can tell exactly who's at the start of this procession and who's at the end of this procession of mourners, right? We can begin to see what direction the procession is walking, right? where, again, it shifts directions or changes direction. So Courbet actually has quite consciously composed this painting, I would argue. But that was not acknowledged or not recognized by the critics. Criticized again for lack of accepted standards of finish. And again, I would argue that all this rough, particularly here again with the crushed stone, all this rough brushwork has to do again with the roughness, right, of life of these provincial villagers, right? It wasn't sort of all smooth sailing in this period. And criticized again for elevating a genre painting, a provincial burial, to a heroic scale, previously reserved for history painting. Can anybody see, where's the body? India.
It's in that hole that's
Is it?
near.
So you're absolutely right. This is
Oh.
so this is the grave. You're absolutely right. And Courbet's done something really interesting, right? Here, the center of the foreground is the grave itself. There's a hole in the earth. And that grave extends into our space, right? So he's created literally this grave, right? This hole in the earth that extends into our space, okay? Which makes it very difficult for the viewer to find a vantage point into the painting, right? To find sort of solid earth on which to stand, to view this scene. Because again, we're here looking at this sort of this gaping hole in the earth that's extending into our space, right? So there's certain areas in which we can't stand in front of the painting. Yeah.
Also, I got that wrong earlier. That's just the whole of the bodies over there being
Yep.
carried by the mass of people.
Yep. So this is the coffin itself, right, approaching the freshly dug grave. And that is carried by 4 pallbearers, these guys in the broad-brimmed hats, okay? Who is this guy? And what's he doing? India.
He's probably like the priest.
Yeah, he's the priest, right? And he is heading up this procession. He's the first to reach the graveside, right? He's stopped here, and what is he doing with his thumbs? What is he holding in his hand? Lexi?
The Bible?
Yeah, he's thumbing through the Bible to get to his place so he can start, right, the ceremony. And who's this guy trying to get the attention of the priest? This guy, shirt sleeves, kneeling beside the grave, trying to get the attention of the priest. Ian.
It looks like the guy's gonna lower the casket.
So he is, the pallbearers will probably lower the casket because they've already got it hoisted up on these white sashes, right? But what has he done? He's not necessarily going to lower the coffin, but he does have something to do with the grave. What has he done? Why is he in shirt sleeves? What does that represent? He doesn't have his jacket on. Why is he in shirt sleeves, Sophia? Yeah, exactly, right? He's a grave digger. He just dug the hole. He's a laborer, like our stone breakers, also in short sleeves, right? He has dug the hole, and he's trying to get the attention of the priest to say, am I done here? Right, you good? Because he's going to leave. He's not going to stick around, okay? And then just behind the priest comes the pallbearers with the coffin, and these 3 figures, which are all representatives of the church. The crucifix bearer, here. This little guy is an incense bearer. He's holding an ostensoir, which is a, I guess it's the vessel that holds the burning incense. And every once in a while he's going to take this ladle out and waft it. And then this guy, and I don't know, it's hard to see, is the candle bearer, and he's holding the candle. Okay? What's happened here? So this is interesting. Think about this. This is a procession arriving at the gravesite. These guys are the first to arrive. The priest stops abruptly and buries his head in his Bible. And everybody else kind of like, stops like dominoes behind the priest, right? And what's happened is they've all come up short at the graveside. What's happened between these 2 guys? Can you see? Why is he looking up at the pallbearer and the pallbearer looking down at him? There's some kind of something going on here. It's very hard to see. If you're standing in front of this painting in the Musée d'Orsay, you can actually see what's happened. Any idea what's happened? The pallbearers bumped into the little boy. What might have happened? Abby?
The candle went out.
Candle went out. And actually you can see, and I can't really pretend to see it right now, but when you're standing in front of this painting, as I have, you can see a plume of smoke. Very clear that that candle has just been snuffed out because there's still smoke, right? So the point is, right, what is the point? The point is, the priest stopped abruptly and everybody else was caught off guard, and these two bumped into each other. And the candle went out, and this little boy's been charged with burying this candle, and it went out, and he's looking up at it, I'm like, what am I gonna do now, right? So Courbet is really representing this the way it actually happened, or at least ostensibly the way it actually happened, with all these little incidents, right? People bumping into each other. This is the messy stuff of a funeral, right? All of these women, right, weeping, burying their faces in their handkerchiefs, men trying to comfort them, right? Candles gone out, a dog has wandered into the scene. So it's sort of this really wonderful sort of representation of sort of the messy stuff of daily life, or the messy stuff of death, right? This is not sort of a neat funeral arranged in a hierarchy, right? And can anybody, so I've got to sort of force myself to keep going, but the thing I wanted to point out was, if this is the front of the procession, right, and these guys sort of, come up just behind the priest, where's the very tail end of the procession? Can anybody sense? So these mourners, most of the mourners are over here, to the right of the graveside. What direction are most of those mourners walking? Moving. Yeah, right? They're moving. All of these guys are in right profile, meaning they're moving left to right, right? So this is the procession. All of these guys are moving this way, right? And then what happens? All of a sudden we have a second row of mourners who are in left profile, which means they're moving right to left. So what's happened that we can't see? Nehemiah?
That everyone's like circled the grave.
Exactly. So what's happening here, and this is really important. So if this is the front of the procession, right? The back of the procession is somewhere over here, right? Some people argue it's this guy, but basically the back of the procession is this the second row of mourners, right? Moving this way, left to right. Off the right framing edge, the procession turns, right? And comes back again up behind, right, the pallbearers and the altar boys. So it's what we call a serpentine procession, right? And my advisor in graduate school, he wrote a book on Courbet, which is one of the reasons why it's hard for me to. So what's happening here is he has represented this serpentine procession, okay, that has taken two turns. It's turned here, come across the back of the painting, and turned again here, okay? And the reason for that is, again, conscious, my advisor argued. Because what is wending its way through this landscape just down the hill from this cemetery, which is an actual place, obviously. Courbet's great uncle was an actual person who was actually buried in this cemetery. You can go to visit his gravesite today if you want. And these geographic features, the Roche du Château and the Roche du Mont, are dominant in the landscape of Courbet's hometown of Ornans, as is the river Lou that wends its way through this landscape. Right beyond the cemetery is a river rushing through the town. So Courbet is creating an illusion of that river in this sort of serpentine procession, right? The way that this river wends its way through the landscape. He wants us to, again, he's trying to replicate not just the way things look, but lived experience, the way things feel, the way it would have felt to be a mourner at this burial, right? So he wants us to smell the freshly dug earth. He wants us to smell maybe the body odor of all of these figures clad in black, right, on a hot summer Sunday. He wants us to hear the sounds of the rushing water of the River Lou right beyond this cemetery. He wants us maybe to hear the clatter of the occasional carriage. There's a road. That road that the Stonebreakers were paving for us is right here behind these figures, right? He wants us to maybe hear the clatter of a carriage, right, on that roadway periodically, right, running by the funeral. So this composition, I would argue, far from being sort of unconscious composition, it's incredibly conscious on Courbet's part, right? It's just not hierarchical. Right? There's a difference between conscious composition, right, and sort of hierarchical composition. The Academy just didn't know what to make of it, so they accused him for lack of conscious composition. To the contrary, it's incredibly consciously composed. Okay, okay, let's see, so much more to say, but, oh yeah, and one other thing here, that contemporary critics, academicians and critics are looking for is, in lieu of sort of that hierarchical composition, triangular or pyramidal composition that would help to sort of orchestrate the relationships between the different figures here, they're looking for gestures and gazes to try to lead us, to try to tell a story, right? Remember the gestures and gazes in the Calling of St. Matthew, for example. They completely revealed what was going on here. We don't get any of that here. Courbet doesn't satisfy that, right? None of these figures, right, gestures or gazes, helps to tell the story at all, okay? So all of the markers, of sort of traditional markers of appropriateness for painting are missing here. And the critics hated it because they didn't know what to make of it, right? And when you don't understand something, what is sort of typical reaction when you don't understand something?
Anger.
Yeah. And the critics leveled, they were angry, hostile critics because they didn't understand what Courbet was doing. It lacked all the traditional markers of appropriateness. So, fast forward about a decade, and we see a man by the name of Manet enter the scene. And Manet, M-A-N-E-T, is not to be confused with Monet, M-O-N-E-T. They're actually quite different painters. Okay? So this is a guy by the name of Edouard Manet. And this is called Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass. Dates to 1863. Okay. So Manet is a very, very unique painter. Some call Manet the father of Impressionism. I think that was even sort of alluded to in one of your readings. Oh, incidentally, I added, you're gonna love to hear this, a bunch of readings to this unit. I flushed it out completely, and then I did it all last night. I don't think I posted the revised document to Blackboard, but I will. So there are additional readings. They're all, again, similarly short, but I just wanted to let you know that, so look out for those. So in one of the readings on Manet, I think even in your readings, it suggested that this is the sort of what you hear a lot. He's the father of Impressionism. My advisor in graduate school also wrote a book on Manet, in which he argues that that's actually pretty far from the truth. Manet was born a completely different generation from the Impressionists. So Manet was born in 1832. Monet, who is the oldest of the Impressionists, is born in 1840. So they're 8 years apart, and they're the closest in age. So they're not really the same generation. And the major works of Manet's are in the 1860s. And Impressionism as a term isn't even coined until 1874. So really, the decade of the 1870s and sort of later belongs to the Impressionists. What Manet is doing in the 1860s is actually unique, is what sort of my advisor argues in his book, which is called Manet's Modernism. So I want to sort of talk to you about Manet. Manet is an incredibly important figure in the history of art, and some would call Manet the first modernist painter. And we have to have a talk about what modernism means in painting. And we will, because for the rest of the class, we're going to be talking about the modern, right? So you need to understand what's up with this word modern. And I'll tell you why some people think Manet is the first modern painter. So this painting, Luncheon on the Brass, just to give you the history, was submitted to the Salon in 1863. Remember, the Salon is that officially sanctioned exhibition venue that the Academy sanctions once annually in the spring. And it's really the only government-sanctioned exhibition in all of France. And if you aspire to be a successful artist, you have to exhibit paintings in the Salon. It's the way the system worked. There were no alternatives to the Salon in this period. So Manet exhibited, or not exhibited, because the Salon was a juried exhibition, meaning you couldn't just exhibit what you wanted, right? You had to submit to a jury and be accepted or refused. And in 1863, there were so many, and this has become increasingly the case throughout the history of the Salon. In 1863, and I can't remember, I did know the numbers at one point, something, I don't know, I'm going to make this up, but something like 3,000 out of 5,000 submissions were rejected, or something like that. So over half, let's say, like just a huge number, right? And there was uproar on the part of the artists whose work had been rejected, just because, and this, again, I got to keep going, but the jury was made up of primarily non-artists, right? Made up of politicians, was made up of aristocrats. And so, these artists, these modern artists that have a more modern sensibility are beginning to be pretty frustrated with this system, right? Of aristocrats, right, and politicians rejecting, artworks. And so there's sort of uproar and furor. It's been brewing for a long time, but in 1863 it reaches a head, and so much anger. This is where Louis Napoleon comes in. Remember, we're talking about the Second Empire. Louis Napoleon is Emperor of France. He does something unprecedented, which is that he decides to mount an exhibition for all of the refused artists so that they get their chance to exhibit their works. And this exhibition is called, very lovingly, the Salon des Refusés, or the Salon of the Rejected Artists, right? So it's Louis Napoleon is doing his best, but I always find it sort of hysterically funny, right? So Manet's work is rejected from the official Salon, but he exhibits it in the Salon des Refusés in 1863, okay? And even so, the critics loathe it. We wouldn't have thought the critics had become any angrier with an artist than they were with Courbet, but they are even angrier about Manet's painting. And one of the reasons Manet's painting is sort of similarly criticized, with one important difference. So critics look at this. The first thing a critic does when he, I say he because they were he's, not permanent, but they really were, when he looks at a painting, he tries to categorize it. Remember that all-important hierarchy of genres? We've got to figure out what category we're dealing with, number one. And here, remember, Courbet got in trouble for treating a genre. They could categorize it. They knew it was genre painting. They knew it was a provincial burial. What they couldn't understand was why he was treating genre painting on a heroic scale, right? That scale was reserved for history. So that's number one criticism. Here, the critics couldn't even categorize the painting, right? So there's a nude woman and a semi-clothed woman. Nude woman prominently displayed in the painting. So this must be history painting, mythological painting, because nudity, traditionally, always was sublimated by having some kind of allegorical content, right? So nudes were either goddesses, or they were muses, or they were nymphs. They came from Greek mythology. So, prominent nude figure, gotta figure out who she is, right? So what is, right, again, the sort of allegorical content? What is the higher significance? Where are her attributes? Who is she, right? If she was Venus, you might see a rose, Venus's attribute, or a scallop shell, or a dolphin. If she was Diana, a crescent, a moon, or a hunting dog, right? Where are her attributes? Who is she? And all we're given is her discarded dress, hat, and basket of fruit and brioche. Okay? These clothes, again, we might have looked for togas, right? Some kind of indication that she was, again, a sort of classical mythological figure, but instead we're given a mid-19th century woman's dress, a very stylish straw hat with a grosgrain ribbon bow, right? All of this anchors her firmly to 1863 Paris and not to antiquity. So try as critics might, they couldn't find an attribute, they couldn't find classical mythological dress, they couldn't find anything, right, that related to an, sort of an obvious higher significance, okay? So again, the subject here lacked appropriate, or sort of traditional markers of appropriateness. It lacked symbolic content, okay? A large-scale nude female required symbolic content to be justified. And it was simply absent here. So this is not history painting, it's not mythological painting, right? It's got to be a genre scene, because we've got, right, all of these sort of details of daily life. We've got mid-19th century clothing and fruits, right, and brioche from the bakery down the street. So it's got to be a genre painting. The setting was actually identified as the Bois de Boulogne, which was a fancy park in Paris, just finished by Haussmann, right? Part of Haussmann's improvements to the city. So this is clearly a genre painting. It's a picnic, but it's a lunch on the grass. Problem solved, right? It's a picnic in this new park. What's the problem with it being a genre painting? Yeah,
Then why is there nude women in the park?
nude women don't picnic with clothed men in the park in Paris in 1863, and nor do they today. They'd probably be arrested. So there's no way these critics could not categorize, right? It was neither genre nor mythological, right? It was not realistic, it was not an actual event, nor was there any obvious higher significance, okay? So this lack of ability to categorize the painting infuriated the critics. What do you do when you don't understand something? You get angry, and they were furious. Not only that, right, this woman and these two men were all recognizable. These are portraits. So the two men are Manet's brother and brother-in-law. They are dressed as upper middle class students, which they were. And the woman was recognizable. So Manet appears to be trying to figure out, what does a nude in the context of modern life look like? If I want to paint a nude in the context of modern life, I don't want to paint a mythological nude. I want to paint a modern nude, a nude in the context of modern life. What does that look like? The answer to that for Manet was either the artist model. Only time, right, you got a nude in the context of modern life was an artist model, or a prostitute. Here, this woman's name is Victorine Meuron. She was identifiable as a young lady in Manet's circle who posed for him. She was an artist model. And here she is in the nude, picnicking in the nude with his brother and his brother-in-law. And again, this just left critics scratching their heads. I want to just show you something interesting. Manet is actually, interestingly, making references to art of the past. He's copying their compositions, their figural groupings, but not adopting any of their symbolic content. So there is precedent for two nude, or one nude and one semi-nude figures in a landscape with two clothed males. This is Titian, Italian Renaissance artist that we didn't look at. This is Titian, painting called Pastoral Concert from 1510. Pastoral Concert. Total precedent for two nude females and two clothed males in a landscape, right? Except for one important fact. These two nudes, look carefully, how are they dressed? Togas, right? Greco-Roman drapes, anchoring them clearly in the Greco-Roman past, in the ancient past. And look for symbols, right, that might reveal their identity. So it's called Pastoral Concert. We know this painting has something to do with music making. The man is playing a stringed instrument called a lute, and she has picked up the recorder, probably belonging to this man, right? Associating her immediately with music. Okay? So what we have here, without getting into details, are two muses of music. These women, these nude women, anchored by their dress in antiquity, right, and associated with music, are not supposed to be physically present to the men. That's why the men appear to be unaware of their presence. They exist in their imagination. They are muses of music. The two men were making music, right, in the countryside. They came to maybe an impasse. They're having a conversation about what song to play next or whatever. And that's where the muses come in. They're muses of music. They exist in the men's imaginations, not physically present to them. So again, that would have immediately sublimated, justified Victorian moral nudity, except for, again, the fact that we can't find those traditional markers of appropriateness. We can't find that symbolic content. We don't find attributes. We don't find classical dress. We don't find anything that would tell us who she's supposed to be, other than Victorian moral artist model. And that was problematic. Yeah?
Was the girl in the background a model as well?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. She's a really, and I'm not sure if anybody does. I've actually studied this painting quite a bit. She's a kind of enigmatic figure because she appears not to have much to do with the other three. This painting was actually originally titled The Bath, and that's where she comes in, although she's not really bathing, right? But this was originally titled The Bath because she was sort of, and there are lots of scenes of classical mythological figures at the bath. Diana at the bath, we saw. Diana at the bath, Diana at the hunt, Diana at the bath. And so her presence could be, again, another allusion to classical precedent, but without satisfying, right, the critic's desire for symbolic content, right? She could sort of be like, okay, this is a goddess at the bath, right? That makes sense. Except that we can't find Diana's crescent moon or Diana's hunting dogs, right? So it's the same idea of her presence sort of suggesting something that existed in the classical tradition, but Manet doesn't go as far as to satisfy critics' longing for, again, those appropriate markers, those sort of traditional markers of appropriateness, symbolic content, etc.
Is there like, I don't know, because we don't know who that lady is in the back, but like, why would she be placed there? It almost kind of looks like a triangle, even
It
with like the tree line and everything, which wouldn't that like suggest like a hierarchy?
Yep. And actually, the reason we have that hierarchy, in quotes, among the figures here, is because Manet took the composition, he stole it wholesale from another Renaissance artist. This is an engraving after Raphael of the Judgment of Paris. What part of this engraving is relevant to our scene? Yeah. So this is the main scene, Judgment of Paris, but over here, there's this composition of two river gods and a nymph seated beside the river. Allegorical figures, right? Manet has pinched this composition wholesale, but set it in the context of modern life, right? Again, not, so literally the composition is taken directly from the lower right-hand corner of this piece, okay? But stripped, the figures are stripped of their allusions, right? Of their sort of historical allusions. These are not, again, river gods and nymphs anymore. These are Parisian students, artists, and their models, okay? So what we think Manet is trying to do is to explore what the nude in the context of modern life would look like. There is a long-standing tradition of the nude in the classical tradition. But he wants to figure out, what does the nude in the context of modern life look like? And one of the reasons we think we're right about that is that there's an important figure in this period. He happens to be a friend and supporter of Manet's. He's a very famous poet, and a sometime art critic, whose name is Charles Baudelaire. You may have heard of him. And in addition to writing some incredibly beautiful poetry, he wrote something in 1863 he wrote an article called The Painter of Modern Life, in which he called upon contemporary artists to paint their daily lived experience, to paint modern life, not to mire themselves in the intricacies of ancient art, right? Not to escape into the ancient or even the biblical past, but to paint, right, modern life. Find, Baudelaire said, the beauty in modern life. And he talks about all these different places where you can find unexpected beauty in modern life. And, interestingly, one of them is in a funeral procession. His examples include such things as funeral procession. And Courbet also writes something interesting. Now, Courbet wrote this before Baudelaire had published The Painter of Modern Life. But Courbet wrote, an epoch can only be reproduced by its own artists. I hold the artists of one century basically incapable of reproducing the aspect of a past or future century. In other words, all those neoclassical painters have no business doing what they're doing. All of those neo-Baroque painters have no business doing what they're doing, right? Paint what you live and experience in your century. You are incapable, according to Courbet, and also probably according to Manet, right, of reproducing the aspect of a past or future century, right? So there is this incredibly new push to paint this modern urban environment that is being built up around these guys. Remember Osmanization. They're seeing modernism emerge. They're seeing a modern urban environment emerge. They're seeing a sort of an industrialized world emerge before their very eyes. All of these things are now happening fast. Life is becoming fast-paced. This is a really interesting time period because this really is the beginnings of what we would call a more modern lifestyle, right? Again, think about it. All of a sudden, with this generation, we can get almost current events, almost simultaneous accounts in the newspapers of things that are actually happening. Remember the frustration of the Romantics, right? When, news of the shipwreck of 1816, I think it was, doesn't reach Paris until the following year, and then Géricault has to start a painting, and he's not painting that scene until 3 years after it transpired, right? That was frustrating, that sort of delay. That's why we said recent past in terms of romantic subjects of romantic history paintings, right? They would have loved current events, but the best they had was the sort of recent past. Now, with the explosion of journalism, with the advent of photography, with the advent of modern transportation, you can jump on a steam train and you can move quickly from one place to the other for the first time in this generation. You can get to the news when it happens and you can report on it. And so the idea of, again, how fast the world is changing, how fast-paced the world is, right? For the first time, these people, this generation, is living a life kind of akin to the life that we're living. Obviously without, computers and phones and so forth, but there are lots of similarities, okay? And so therefore there are calls, right, to paint this new modern life, this new modern experience, right? To paint the sort of new, industrialized world. So all of that is happening in this generation, really of the 1860s, is when all of this comes to a head. I want to just, I've got a couple more minutes, so I want to just use them since we missed Thursday. Show you one more. Here she is. Manet, and then Thursday we'll talk about Impressionism. So this is Manet too, and this is a painting called Olympia. And it dates to, well, he started, I'll call it 1865 because it was exhibited in the Salon of 1865. He started it probably in 1863, right in the aftermath of the fiasco with the luncheon on the grass in the Salon de Refusé. Manet went back to the studio. Critics, that is, had loathed the painting of Victorine Meurent. Not only could they not understand who she was, or sublimate or justify her nudity, but they loathed the way in which she was painted. What I didn't talk about is Manet is starting to discard use of those techniques that were developed during the Renaissance, those very techniques that were developed to create the illusion of three-dimensional figures. Techniques like modeling in light and shade, like Leonardo's chiaroscuro, that resulted in these beautiful, soft, right, bodies, these soft figures. Manet is beginning to refuse to use modeling in light and shade, and he's also beginning to refuse to use perspective. So he's flattening spaces and he's flattening figures. Why is he doing that? Does anybody have any ideas? So all of a sudden, after all this history I've been talking about since the Renaissance, where the whole point of painting is to try to hide the fact that the canvas, the picture plane, is two-dimensional. Use all of these really sophisticated techniques to create the illusion of a three-dimensional world on a flat surface. The last thing those artists wanted was for us to see the flatness of the picture plane. Acknowledge that painting is two-dimensional. Acknowledge, right, that painting is material. It's paint on canvas, because we're never supposed to see the material of painting. They didn't interfere with the illusion. The illusion has to be pure, has to be complete, right? Why all of a sudden do you think Manet is beginning to call attention to the flatness of the picture plane, to the material properties of painting, to the fact that paint is, in matter of fact, paint on canvas? Abby?
Is it because of photography becoming a new technology?
Absolutely is. And what would that have to do with anything? Photography poses the biggest single challenge to painters to date. Why is photography such, really in some ways, not an enemy of painters, but it forces ambitious painters to entirely rethink what the goals of painting are. Why would photography be a problem? India.
Because you can capture something as it is, and you know, it just quickly.
So how is photography, so if you are a realist painter, and I'll end I promise in a minute, if you are a realist painter, you want to recreate, right, a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface. And you're going to use every technique at your disposal to do that, right, persuasively. Now all of a sudden we have this technology, right, that can recreate the three-dimensional world persuasively. It is going to be better, meaning more realistic, than even the most realist painter. It's also going to be faster, and ultimately it's going to be cheaper. So photography is not only better at doing what realist painters have traditionally done, it's faster and it's cheaper. And by 1863, it is widely disseminated. By 1863, any middle class member of Manet's circle could walk down the street, one of these new broad tree-lined boulevards, hop into a photographer's studio and get their portrait snapped. So the idea is, the question is, what is the role of painting in a context where photography exists and can replicate the world better, faster, and cheaper? So painters begin to entirely rethink the goals of painting. They have to rethink it. And the first thing that Manet does is says, let's get back to basics. Painting is paint on canvas. Let's not try to hide those things. Let's rather embrace them. Let's reveal them and let's embrace them. And all of a sudden, we see painting begin to become flat. After centuries of painters using techniques to try to camouflage the two dimensions of the picture plane, now artists are embracing it. That is why we think of Manet as being one of the first modern painters, because he is the first to embrace the flatness of the picture plane and the physical materials of picture making, of painting, paint on canvas, right? Without trying to hide those things. Trinity.
So I'm a little confused. Is this naturalism or realism?
So that's a good question. It is technically called naturalism, but it's under, so all of these things are under the heading of realism. And I will, when we talk next time, so realism is up here, and then naturalism and impressionism are offshoots of realism. And I'll tell you just really briefly, and I'll let you go. Has to do with the subjects. They're all under the rubric of realism. But naturalism, the naturalist painters tend to paint in terms of subject the urban poor. And the impressionists tend to paint as subjects the suburban middle classes. So it's the subjects that differ. The naturalists are interested in sort of like the urban working poor, and the impressionists are interested in the suburban, right, middle class leisure, leisure pursuits. But all of these three, realism, naturalism, and impressionism, are related. But we'll talk more about the differences next class. So we're just going to talk about this painting, and then we'll start a class on impressionism on Thursday. When I get home after my second class, I'll post the updated. You can start with the readings that are there, but I'll post the updated reading. So try to get through the realism, at least the readings on Courbet and Manet.